And hello, everybody. I see some familiar names on the list of attendees, so I think we're going to have a very interactive group, and I'm happy about that. So I'm going to walk you through a few things. I'd like to first share with you how much I appreciate the fact that we can do these type of sessions over the web, but I thought you might like to see, for those of you that haven't met me, you might like to see what I look like. Yeah, that's me. In fact, that's a live photo of me doing this seminar. So anyhow, what I thought I might seriously start with is a little bit of information that's recently been collected by SysGrip. For those of you that aren't familiar with SysGrip, it's the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation. So they spend a lot of time trying to understand why people do or do not participate in clinical trials. This work was done late last year and has been presented a couple of times, but you'll continue to see these data being shared through a series of seminars that Ken Getz from SysGrip has been putting on. We've been helping participate in those, and at other meetings. I know that Ken plans to present some of these data at DIA. But what I wanted to share with you today are just just a little bit of the data. There's an awful lot, and in fact, I was at a conference with him yesterday where he shared much more information than I'm about to share. But I thought I'd at least sort of lay out the landscape for you at a macro level in terms of what's going on in people's minds about clinical trials. Now, this particular data was collected globally. I want to say there was something like 6,000 people who participated. So again, I'll share with you sort of the high-level results, and Ken, if you're interested, Ken can certainly give you a lot more details, and I can get you in touch with him if you like. So in terms of general public perceptions, how willing are you to participate in a clinical research study? The overall response was 87%. Now what's interesting is this question has been asked over the past, 8 or 10 years, 3 different times, and each time we get just about the same result. It's usually somewhere 85% or above, and it's in the high 80s, which tells us that the overall perception hasn't changed much, and that is people, they see the value of participating in clinical research. I think our challenge as an industry is how do you take that and then make sure that for an individual study, we're getting the same level of interest. So what are the top perceived benefits and risks? As you'll notice here, this is broken out overall as well as by region. So you can see, again, this was a global survey, and there's some interesting points that come up at the regional level. But generally speaking, the benefits people see are the advancement of science, helping improve lives, and potentially helping improve my condition. But this was interestingly a bit lower than the rest. Notice South America. Clearly an outlier in terms of how they see the possibility of improving their condition. So that tells us something. What exactly, I don't know, but we need to understand why do they feel that way. When we start looking at risks, possibility of side effects jumps to the top, particularly in North America and in Europe, which again is somewhat interesting. Yesterday in the session, we had probably about 30 people from various pharma companies, and there was a lot of speculation and discussion around, what could be driving some of these numbers. I think for us to really know, we'll have to dig deeper. But again, it gives us some direction in terms of things to be aware of. There is clearly a difference of opinion in this concern between North America, Europe, and the Asia-Pac and South America respondents. Possible overall risk to my health, a little higher in women than in men, but again, interesting. This is one that surprised our group yesterday, the possibility of receiving placebo. A lot of people in the group thought that this should be much higher than 13%. But, again, there was a lot of debate about what did people really understand in this questionnaire, what was their interpretation of the question. So I think that it's fair to say that for an interventional trial where somebody's not feeling well, this one probably jumps a bit higher. But, I guess the key point is that these are, again, general trends. They don't necessarily apply to each individual study. And this was another one that we surprised the group. The possible disclosure of my private medical information, look how much higher it is in South America and in Asia Pacific. So just, some food for thought. Now, if you look at, and I find this one interesting too, where do people prefer to get their information about clinical trials versus where do they actually get their information? Well, they prefer to get it from their primary care physician and their specialty doc. But in reality, they're getting most of their information from the internet or through email or through media. So people are being exposed or are out seeking information about trials through forms of media, but they would really rather hear about it from their doctor, which again brings up an interesting point. You know, how do we get more information to primary care physicians and other physicians about studies that are going on in their area? I think that's another industry-wide conundrum. If we look at the top information sources between, you know, from a survey done in 2004 and then the one that was just recently done by Syscript, you can see the change. People now are getting more, you know, more information from their doctor and their physician, but a lot more information from the internet, less from traditional media. This is the one that really jumps up, the whole question about the leveraging the internet for information. Top sources of information about clinical research, you can see, again, we highlighted internet's very high here in North America. By the way, we broke out preferred and actual for South America and for Asia Pac again, so you can see some of the differences. But this is the thing I find most fascinating. In South America and in Asia Pac, you can see there's a heavy reliance on family for information. Now, what this says to me is it's not just a question of the doctor saying to the patient, you know, here's a trial, I think you're a good candidate, here's the informed consent, et cetera. I'm oversimplifying, of course. But the point here is that these people really rely very much on their family. So we've got to make sure that whatever information we're providing makes sense not just to the patient, but to the people in their social network and the people that they rely on for their, you know, to help them make decisions. Very important point here for these parts of the world. And then who do you actually consult with before you decide whether to join a study? As you can see in North America, it's primarily going to be their healthcare provider, whereas in other regions of the world, it's much more a family decision. Again, South America and Asia Pac. How important were the following factors in influencing your decision to participate? I find this one kind of interesting because, you know, the overall quality of medical care is interesting, access to professionals. A lot of that's driven by North America. And again, you see a lower response in other parts of the world relative to that question and how important it is. Learning about my disease, regular updates, etc. Again, you know, you can get a sense of what are some of the things that people are concerned about or see as value in terms of whether or not they wanted to participate in a study. This was also interesting. How difficult was it to understand the informed consent? Generally speaking, not that difficult. Well, not at all difficult, 50%. But you know, it gets a little challenging when you start looking here. And again, you see it a little higher outside the United States in terms of the difficulty. Now, who knows what's causing that? It could be translation issues. It could be just the complexity of the ICD in general, which we all know can be a concern. But I think this helps us again understand that it's important that we communicate effectively about informed consent, and we can use various tools to do that beyond just the document itself. This is another important thing. How, after reading informed consent, did it make you much more or somewhat more willing to participate? Look at Asia Pac. They have trouble understanding it, but once they do, then they're much more likely to participate. So, and the same with South America. So it would appear that there's a lot of, I don't know if misinformation is the right word or lack of information about trials in this part of the world, but we need to do something to help improve their understanding. This is also interesting. Who most motivated you to stay in the study? Look at what percentage of it is just people on their own. So myself, it was me. I decided I wanted to stay in. And again, that's driven a lot by North America. If you look at the rest of the world, there's about a 50-50 split between them and somebody else helping them decide. But it's interesting that in North America, you know, people say, well, I did it because I thought it was the right thing for myself. And then what motivated you, and these are the two that I really find interesting, is keeping my promise and my relationship with the site staff. Now, if you look at things like compensation, information, you know, hoping they'll have a positive response, free procedures, these are all very logical responses in terms of the benefit to the patient. But when we start getting into things like keeping my promise, what is it that drives somebody to have that be their motivator? And that's where I want to go next. A lot of the questions that you saw or will see in this SysScript survey are very logical in terms of how one would respond. But some of these things like keeping my promise, whether or not that's logic or emotion or what that's driving that is a whole other question. So I want to start kind of moving in that direction. There's a lot of talk today about various tools we can use to engage patients, and some very good things are going on. From a technology perspective, there's a lot of really interesting things happening that make it easier for people to participate, and therefore, they will be more engaged because they can spend maybe less time. Maybe there's an app or something that's actually kind of fun for them to use. There's a lot of different ways to leverage technology, and we're seeing some interesting advances there. The other thing we hear people talk a lot about is the form of media. So there's a lot of questions about, well, should we use Facebook? Should we use print? Should we use search engine? What's the best media, or what's the best method for getting the question or getting the information about the trial in front of the potential volunteer? But I'm going to submit to you, those are two very important pieces of the equation, but we're missing often that third leg of the stool. And that is, what exactly is the message that people need to hear, and why? What is it? What is going to really motivate them? Okay, great. We make it easy to be in the study. That we all want to do that. We get the information in front of the people in using the right media in the most cost-effective way. But then, what exactly do we say? I mean, if we say something like, would you like to be a guinea pig in a diabetes trial? We all know we're not going to get a very good response. If we say something like, are you between the ages of 35 and 55, you have type 2 diabetes and currently taking metformin, we'll get some response. The question is, how engaged will that person be, or how interested are they really? And what I'm going to talk about today is how we take it to that next level, where we really understand what people are thinking, what motivates them, and there's some methods that are being developed to help make that happen. So if you ask that practical question, you're going to get a practical answer. Would you like to be compensated for participating in the study? I think most people are going to say yes. That's obviously a simple one. But when you get into things like, can you come to 5 visits that are 1 hour each over the next 5 weeks? That's a very practical question. Also a very important question. I don't mean to diminish it. But if you really want to know what motivates people from an emotional perspective, then you've got to go deeper. You've got to dig below the surface and really begin to understand some of the issues and motivations. So when we look at behavioral science, what we try to do is to develop a behavioral strategy is identify what the objective is, and in our case it's going to be usually consent, be randomized, and participate in a trial throughout the course of the study. But we need to understand the psychological insights in order to in order to understand why somebody would want to make that happen. Why do they want to stay in because they're keeping their promise? What's behind that? And then based on what we learn, we can then develop a behavioral strategy. So today, what we see is sort of the traditional current patient journey, if you will, of joining a study. There's the recruitment phase and there's the retention phase. Now, there's 2 elements of the recruitment phase. One is raising awareness that the study is a possibility for that individual, and then converting them into a randomized patient. So I kind of broke these down a little bit further too. So people first, somehow they hear about the study. It might be a poster in the investigator's waiting room. It might be through their doctor. It might be through a family member. It might be directly from the investigator or nurse coordinator. But somehow they hear about it. If it's a direct-to-patient outreach, usually there's some kind of a pre-screener. This might be a website. It might be a call center. If they pass that, then they're given the option of contacting the investigator or having the investigator contact them. But the initial contact takes place. Hopefully they make an appointment. They come in. They're consented. They're randomized. And then they attend all their appointments and ultimately exit the trial. Now, there are a number of things that we do in each one of these steps to keep patients engaged. And again, what media do we need to use? How do we make it easy for the patient to make an appointment, what kind of technology can we leverage, all those things. But again, the messaging piece here, what you say to that person at these various stages is also extremely important. And that's something that I think has often been neglected. We've just assumed that the doctor and the nurse at the study center are going to be able to make this conversion. And you know, they do, reasonably successful, but I think there are ways we can enhance that engagement of the patient with the study overall and with the site staff. So if you look at the traditional way of doing planning for a study, we review literature, we look at the protocol, and we compare it with the standard of care in a number of countries and or institutions. This, of course, has huge implications on where you want to go with the study. The piece that's often missing is the primary behavioral research that then provide us the behavioral insights so we can develop messaging appropriately. And then how does that relate to engagement? Well, this strategy has to be evidence-based, number one, and we need to understand how these people make their decisions, who are their social influences, and I'll go back to the CISGRIP data regarding Asia Pacific and Latin America. The family, very important here. And then finally, what's going to motivate them and what is going to help them want to seek more information or go that next step. Yesterday at the session that we had, you know, it's a lot of people who are very deeply involved in trying to drive patient recruitment. And I asked the group, you know, how many of you here, when you try to explain to your friends or family what you do for a living, and you say to them, well, I try to find patients for clinical trials, how often does someone say back to you, oh, so you try to find guinea pigs? And everybody had that experience at one point. That's an important factor in social influence. You know, people, if they say, hey, I'm going to go join a clinical trial, you know, sometimes people look at you like, what, are you crazy? These are things you need to understand for that specific protocol. For example, if there's a very unmet medical need and it's a deadly disease, a lot of people aren't going to give that response of, oh, be a guinea pig. They're going to go, wow, maybe there's a chance. That's sort of the psychological response. On the other hand, if it's a disease that's very easily treatable, you know, there's a lot of good medicines out there, people might say, well, why would you do that? I mean, why take that risk when there's good medicines available today? So these things, again, I want to make sure, I probably will repeat this too many times, but all of this is study specific. It all depends on what the technology is we're studying, what the disease is, what the current standards are that are available, how risky is it to the patient. A lot of different things drive their behavioral response. So to drive change, you've got to maximize the touch with highly personalized communications. That's what I've been talking a lot about. We have to create a supportive environment. Often that's the family and or the healthcare provider in North America. Leveraging ecosystems of influencers, again, healthcare provider and others, and then setting the stage for an ongoing relationship with these people and their supporters. From a process standpoint, we need to understand, as I said, what messages, how do we do that? Well, you can look at historical recruitment data, what messages were used, what results did we gain. We can do psychographic surveys, we can interview patients, we can do focus groups with patients, and we can do message testing. As it relates to where to deliver that message, through the patient pathway in the particular healthcare system, sometimes media makes sense, sometimes it's the influencers we would like to approach to get the message out to patients because of the trust. And then finally, can we capture all this and turn these data into motivators? If we understand all this, then, you know, delivering a personalized message, doing it in a personalized delivery method. You know, some people like text messaging, some people like email, some people like telephone calls. It all depends on the individual. And then come up with a consistent approach to develop this methodology. Okay, so I'm going to give a couple case studies here. This is one that was done for an Alzheimer's disease study prior to the study initiating. We're currently enrolling the study right now. But what we found was when you talk to the caregivers, there were some things that kind of jumped out. One was their time is really being pulled. The other is, you know, this idea of balancing care for their loved one. also trying to be patient and deal with what their loved one's going through and be strong for them. And then there's a whole question around, denying the fact that their loved one is ill, and also balancing that against hope and what can be done. So, a little more detail around this. So the pull on their time, what we found was a lot of these folks are still raising their children, and so that becomes a barrier for them to bring their loved one to a study or to the investigator site. Very strict schedule, because they have other commitments. So it restricts their ability to participate sometimes. And then in terms of the balance of care, they've promised to take care of this person. That really has a huge impact on what they believe is the right thing to do and what's going to motivate them. They worry about whether they can provide adequate care. So, a lot of these things are not really too surprising, but it's really interesting to validate and break them out and see how strongly they influence the decision. I mentioned this case yesterday, but this one here is particularly interesting. On a different study a few years back, I sat in on a focus group of caregivers, and we asked the question whether or not they would be willing to put their loved one into a study, and the answer was resoundingly no. And we said, well, why not? And they said, because if anything ever happened to this person, I wouldn't be able to forgive myself. I love them, and I don't want to take the risk. I just can't do it. And so we said, okay, and we carried on a little further with the focus group, and then we asked the question, are you aware that the current medications your people are taking really don't slow down the progression of the disease, but basically just mask the symptoms temporarily? And they all said, no, we're pretty sure it slows down the disease. And we said, no, actually, if you look at the data, that's not what it does. It basically alleviates the symptoms, but it's not going to help them stay healthy longer. And then we said to them, if we were doing a study where we were trying to slow down the progression of the disease, would you be willing to put them in? And then the answer was resoundingly yes. So the message that we developed was very clear that today's medicines do not slow down the progression of Alzheimer's. We are studying how to slow down the progression of the disease. And those things flew through IRBs. It wasn't an issue. It wasn't like anything misleading or misguiding or anything. But the fact that we knew what was important for these caregivers to understand had a huge impact on the enrollment rate for this study, and this study filled up very quickly. So there's one example where getting these type of data, digging down and finding out what people are really thinking, had a profound effect on the timeline. This is another case study where we had a similar situation. This was a study where we really had to get it completed before a certain deadline, and we were concerned about the randomization rate that we had in the plan. It was very, very aggressive. If we did not hit the timeline, the entire study would have been a total waste, and it was outsourced to a CRO, and it was, in the tens of millions of dollars. So it was a huge project. In this case, we sat down with women. This was an osteoporosis study, and we sat down with women who were in postmenopausal years, asked them a variety of questions. We finally came to the question of, would you join an osteoporosis study? And the answer was, again, resoundingly no. And we said, well, why not? And they said, well, I'm not that worried about osteoporosis. There's plenty of good stuff on the market. I don't think I'm going to get it. So there was a variety of reasons they didn't think it was worthwhile. So we started asking a little bit more, and we said, well, what if we told you we weren't just looking at that, we were looking at cardiovascular health, we were looking at uterine cancer, breast cancer, other women's health diseases in conjunction with osteoporosis. And then they all said, well, yeah, I would join that one. And we said, well, why? What's the difference? And they said, well, because even though it may not help me, it might help my daughter or it might help my granddaughter. And then we started digging deeper, and what we uncovered was there was this sense of community and this very strong sense of paying it forward. So we named the study Generations, which went fine. But we didn't say anything about osteoporosis. We just said working together to build a strong knowledge of women's health. That's the message we put out there. And you can see this is a spinal cord, and these are all women's hands of different ethnic backgrounds, a diverse set of people who are coming together to help enhance knowledge around women's health. This trial enrolled more than twice as fast as the phase 2 study. And we believe that a lot of it had to do with, again, the messaging and what we were trying to convey to potential candidates. They felt like they were part of something bigger than just, their own personal health. Okay, so when we start talking about how to get patient involvement into clinical studies, what are the things we need to do? So I want to break this down into 3 categories, because we can gain insights from patients at various stages, but it seems to me these are the 3 most important. First of all, before the protocol is approved, it would really be nice to get information back from patients about what they think. So this would help inform the development of a more patient-focused trial design. We all know we reach out to investigators and we reach out to opinion leaders, or the key medical scientists, and that's great because we want to make sure we have a good, solid scientific study. But how often do we ask patients, would you do this? And if not, why not? So we can find out what's going to motivate them to participate. What are the barriers? Some of these are very logical questions, not just emotional. What trial-related experience, do you have, or what do you think people are going to think about with the condition that we're studying? What tools should we be developing to facilitate your involvement? All of that can be put in place up front. Another great point that came up in yesterday's meeting was the idea of if there are certain outcomes that patients think are important to report, should we build those into the study? Maybe there's certain things patients think, look, this is the most important thing to me about why I would want to feel better from this given disease. Maybe we can build some PRO type of questions in, again, up front that will be useful to patients downstream. So once the protocol's finalized, then before you have your first patient in, or while you're doing your site setup, et cetera, we should be out doing message testing, similar to what I just described with the osteoporosis study and with the Alzheimer's disease. And here we can look at what messages are important, what's going to get people engaged, what kind of tools should we be developing, do we need to have apps to help you with your retention, maybe appointment reminders, what kind of things would make it easy for you to participate in the study. And then last but not least, during the study, collecting information, but absolutely at the end of the study, understanding what that experience was like and what we can learn so that next time we can make that experience a little bit better. So these, again, are the 3 key stages of when we should engage patients into designing and measuring our studies. Now, I think what's coming up in the future is we're going to see an evolution of databases around relationship management. So by using validated behavioral surveys, we can segment members and we can tailor members of the community. And we can tailor communications to really understand what's driving their behavior and what will more likely influence their change. And most people have experienced Myers-Briggs or other types of surveys that tell you what your personality is like and what your predisposition is. It's the same concept here. Some people are good at some things, not so good at others. Some people focus on some things, other people don't. So to really understand what motivates somebody and what their personality disposition is will be extremely useful in how we tailor the message for that individual. And what we'll see happening is people will include some of these surveys early on in the screening process so it can help sites and patient recruitment organizations understand what type of messaging would apply to that individual. So how can we use this knowledge to make sure that how we message to these individuals makes more sense from a motivational standpoint for that particular person. As we implement these things, we'll also use, again, whichever form of media is most appropriate for that individual. They might like mobile, they might like the web, they might like multimedia. It's hard to say, but we can validate what we send out to them. This will then feed back into our campaign so that as we get better and better at this, we'll be able to deliver custom messages out to patients and keep them engaged right from the first moment they hear about the trial all the way through the last patient visit and beyond. So with that, I'll close. It gives us about 20-25 minutes for questions, and I'll go ahead and open things up.
Thank you very much. Yes, we've had quite a stream of questions coming in while you've been speaking. I've kind of grouped them by topic. We've had several questions dealing with particularly difficult trial groups. This person asks, what techniques have you seen work, or what initiatives are underway to help to reach the primary care physicians and other healthcare influencers?
Oh, that's a great question. So there are some things from a technology perspective that are taking place. I can tell you that some of the basic tools that are used in the marketing of pharmaceuticals and devices can also be used in getting information out to physicians about clinical trial opportunities. So I'm assuming we're not talking about investigators here. We're talking about referring physicians, referring potentially nurses, pharmacists, whoever, that have an interaction with the patient who might be eligible for a trial. In fact, we had a little bit of a conversation about this yesterday. I think there's a huge gap in physicians really understanding how to get a patient into a trial, even if they'd like to. As we all know, if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, it's extremely complicated to find out, what studies are in your area, what might be appropriate for a given patient. But we're beginning to develop some tools. In fact, we've got one that's a prototype right now that allows a physician, an investigator to reach out to their digital social network of referring physicians or the physicians in their immediate area that they interface with in an automated fashion that would send out information about the trial in medical terms. So it's physician-to-physician communication, or healthcare provider to healthcare provider. And what it would do is describe the trial, what the background is on the science, at a very high level, but just so that the referring physician could understand, what the science is that's being studied, what the inclusion-exclusion criteria are, and then push that information out to physicians who are, again, potential referrals. And that way, if they do have a patient, they can refer that patient over to the investigator. It's almost like, I like to think of it as an automated version of the old standard, it seems like every time we do what we call site support materials, we provide the doctor with a letter template they can send to all their doctors in their area. I don't think anybody ever actually does that. We put the template in there, but no one uses it just because it takes so much time. So this is an automated electronic version of that. We're calling it the digital referral system. And again, it's in pilot phase right now, but that's one thing I think that could help. The other is just, getting information through the local healthcare system. Gosh, I mean, there's some of the more standard ways that we've done it in the past where, grand rounds, other types of communications to potential referring physicians. But the problem is it's so manpower intensive that it drives up costs, and I think we need to come up with some form of an automated version to make that occur. So that's the question around healthcare professional awareness. The question about difficult populations, so I presume that's talking about either rare diseases or really, really tight inclusion-exclusion criteria. Is it more rare disease?
Well, it was a combination of both. They were talking about rare diseases, but then they were also talking about diseases that tend to affect disadvantaged populations, for example, homeless and high-risk patients who are hard to reach. Yeah.
So now, again, we're talking more about media, what methodology would one use to get the message in front of homeless people. So, golly, that's a tough question. It really depends on the population. And we can reach out to those people and find out what message would resonate by doing patient interviews and things of that nature. But as far as which media is the best, I'm not really a media analyst. I know who I would go to find out, but it's not really something I'm an expert in. I mean, I can throw out some ideas, but that's all they are, and they're not necessarily tested and validated. I can tell you what we've been doing as it relates to rare diseases, and I'm sure others are doing this too, which is doing social listening on the web, identifying where conversations are taking place about that disease, understanding how search engines being used around that disease, and then leveraging that information to reach out to some of those individuals. Let me back up for a second. First of all, you leverage some of that information to understand what type of lingo people are using, what type of concerns they have, what are some of the emotional impacts of the disease, and then we can craft some rough ideas around messaging. Then we go back to those folks, see if we can solicit their input on the actual messaging itself, do a market research survey with them, and then test the messaging we're considering to see if indeed it does resonate. And then if it does, then we can use that, once we hone down the final message, we can then use, again, that same vehicle, communication vehicle or media, to get that information in front of the people that are out there talking about the disease online.
Okay, another topic area is kind of getting down to the nuts and bolts of your program. How do you select the patients to be sure that the responses are representative?
Oh, that's a great question. So there's two steps, ideally. Now, what you want to do, first of all, is have a group of people that are obviously victims of the disease and are willing to talk about it. And you can do that. You can talk to patients anytime. This is often a common misperception. Once a patient's in a trial, then it gets tricky, obviously. But prior to a person joining a trial, if they come forward and say, yeah, I'm willing to talk to you about my disease, that's perfectly okay. And we've done it around the world. It's basic market research. It happens all the time. So you can talk to people who have the disease and do it in a brainstorming fashion. So, for example, when I talked about the focus groups for Alzheimer's disease or for osteoporosis, we were brainstorming with these people. We were bouncing different ideas around, and that's where you need a good moderator. So somebody that can really, pick up on a comment, dig a little deeper, kind of see where that path goes, and you begin to get ideas that are really your hypothesis. Now, the next step is then, okay, you develop a couple ideas that you want to test, which you learn through the focus group. You then take that hypothesis and you test it in a quantitative fashion, and that's where you develop a very well-written survey, and you have to ask the questions the right way. And there is really a science and an art to this. You have to ask the question the right way to really get good quality data back, but you want to get a quantitative result to make sure that your hypothesis really does resonate across the population you're trying to reach out to. So that's the methodology.
Okay, we also have a question about the study that you've been quoting from in your presentation. Sandy asks, when was this study conducted and over what time frame?
The one on osteoporosis, let me think, that was done in 2004 or 5 is when it started, and it finished enrollment about a year and a half later. It was a very large study. And then the other one is ongoing. We're actually conducting that study currently. The other Alzheimer's disease study that I mentioned started in 2008, I think, and I think they finished enrollment in like 2009 or 10. It took about a year, also about a year and a half, maybe 2 years to enroll.
We have a question regarding building engagement through the Internet. This person asks, we are developing and testing online psychological interventions, and when we perform trials, we disseminate, recruit, engage, and obtain consent online. It would be useful to hear how to create lasting engagement when your communication is over the Internet.
Oh boy, I think a lot of it has to do with what we just talked about with the messaging. What is it that's going to keep these people motivated? What kinds of information do they want to hear? What are the emotional drivers that keep them participating? So it gets back to that one slide I showed that has the 3 different things, the social influences, the logical decisions that they make, and then, sort of the emotional drivers. And there's no simple answer to that. You really have to do the research to find out for that particular population what's going to work. And I guess, this is one of the things I really would like to try to hammer home. We as an industry tend to think that there's some kind of tool or there's some kind of magic bullet that's going to engage people, and it's not that simple. It has a lot to do with really understanding human behavior, the psychology of the patient, and those tools. I don't mean to diminish their value, but they're going to be useful in certain situations and not useful in other situations. I've actually had people say to me, recruiting on the internet doesn't work. Well, yes, it does, and yes, it doesn't. It depends on how you use it. I like to use this analogy. If you are asking someone to drive a nail into a 2x4 and you hand them a screwdriver, the screwdriver is not going to work. But if you ask them to put a screw into a 2x4 with a screwdriver, it will work. So it's all applying the right tool to the right situation. So I don't mean to sound vague or non-committal, but the truth is there's no simple answer. Each protocol is unique, and we can learn from that patient population what kinds of things drive their behavior over time, but there's no one simple solution or answer for all studies.
Sounds good. This attendee asks, please address your experience with regards to use of social media with their associated metrics in regard to return on investment.
Well, again, it depends, but if it's used well, it can be one of the most cost-efficient ways. The reason I say that is, so let's assume it's a study where there's a high unmet medical need or it's a common chronic disease. What's nice is, people will seek information from social media and other sources, word search, for example, Google and Yahoo, et cetera. So what's really cool about social media, though, is, you can geo-target. So if you have an investigator site in, zip code 12345, you can put a radius around that zip code and only serve up that banner ad for people who are talking about that disease in that geographic location. Very, very targeted, very, very cost effective. On the other hand, if it's a disease that's highly satisfied in the marketplace, people aren't that worried about it, there's not that much online traffic going, talking about the disease, then of course putting up a whole bunch of banner ads isn't really going to help you that much. So, another great example would be if it's an acute setting. So I've seen situations where we're talking about trying to capture a patient immediately after having a heart attack. I mean, social media is not going to work for that at all. You've got to have things working and a communication system set up. The healthcare professional within the hospital setting, at the point of care when that patient first presents, and things of that nature. So there's literally no value whatsoever in any kind of social media in that circumstance. So again, it really depends on the situation, but when used appropriately, it can be extremely cost effective and very, very powerful.
We've had a couple questions regarding how to retain patients in long-term studies, and one of them specifically said in long-term trials where there's a placebo arm. That's a good one. I mean, especially if you're on placebo and you're having increased or you continue to have the symptoms of whatever the disease is. For example, let's say you're doing a pain study. You don't want to be a patient in the placebo arm, unless of course it's a placebo arm with a comparator drug. So, one of the things I guess that I would say is that's a great question during protocol design. That's the kind of thing that you really need to understand from patients to understand what their resistance will be to being on placebo. How intense will it be? Let's say it's for example, a triglyceride study, and you're asking a patient to be on placebo. It might not be so bad, because they don't really feel any symptoms. I mean, from a medical perspective, I don't know if it's a good idea. I don't know ethically if it's the right thing to do. But in terms of how the patient might respond, it may not be that big of a deal. So, again, it depends on the circumstances. But let's assume that it's a situation where there's not a really bad reaction that the patient experiences. In that case, I think it's really methods for allowing that patient to communicate effectively
with the physician, the investigator, and their staff. I think simple things like saying thank you, providing thank you items, helping people understand that they're part of a bigger question here. Again, a lot of it you'd really have to ask that question of patients with the disease during protocol design and during the message development, but those are the kinds of things that I would hypothesize would be useful.
Another person asks, how do you incorporate this into CLIA waivers, particularly for home use or over-the-counter studies?
Say that one more time.
Yes, I'm not exactly understanding it either. How to incorporate this into CLIA waiver, home use, or OTC studies?
I don't know what a CLIA waiver is. I apologize. But
okay,
as far
well, maybe this person will specify.
Okay. But, for in-home studies, again, I generally speaking, the advantage of an in-home study is the patient doesn't have to go to the investigator site, so theoretically it's easier for them to participate. So then it's really just a question of, what kinds of communications will be effective to make sure that they, feel engaged and part of something bigger than themselves, if that's the right motivator. It's really, again, I hate to keep coming back to it, but what we have to understand is we've got to go out and talk to the patients and understand for that particular study, what is it that's going to be the messaging or what is it that's going to motivate them to join and to stay in? And it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's specific to each study. So I guess what I'm suggesting here is there's a methodology and there's a tool that we're not leveraging as clinical trial professionals, and that is getting out there, asking the patients what they think, and really, really working hard to make sure that we're meeting their needs when we ask them to participate in a clinical study. We can't, and all too often, we sit back and we come up with these solutions that we think are great ideas, but they're not necessarily because we're not the people that are joining the study. It's that simple. We need to know from them. We need to get it straight from them to really understand what it is that holds them back or gets them excited.
Wow, that leads perfectly into the next question. How do you start organizing patient groups for empowered participation in clinical trials?
Oh, I like that. Oh, this is a good one. Well, again, lots of tools that we can use, but we can reach out through advocacy. We can do direct-to-patient outreach, and we can pull those folks and find people who are interested in participating in these focus groups or these interviews, and then, of course, work with them to develop the tools that are going to be best to engage patients, not only as they as we try to get them into the trial, but staying in the trial. And then in some cases even, people may want to continue to be in a group after the trial's completed. So, we can do that through online communities. You could do it through grassroots efforts in local communities. Of course, we need to be careful during the study that we don't have people who are in the trial sharing, outcome information and things of that nature. But there are ways that it can be managed. So I hope I answered that question.
We have a question referring back to physicians and their involvement in the process. Have you ever run into situations where physicians don't want to refer their patients because they're afraid that they'll lose revenue for further follow-ups?
Yeah, that's one of the hypotheses that's out there that people have heard. It's kind of anecdotal, but it does make a lot of sense. It's interesting. I heard of a survey actually yesterday. Ken Getz mentioned this. That often what doctors are saying, what healthcare professionals are saying is in North America, is it's not really a question of the revenue that they're concerned about. It's they just don't know how to refer patients into trials because they don't have the information, and it takes way too much of their time to go get it. So if we can come up with a method where we can make it easy for docs to understand what trials are going on in their area, what are the criteria of, what are the inclusion-exclusion criteria, what's the appropriate patient type. I don't know that, I get the whole idea that they would lose revenue. Sometimes I think there's also a factor of being concerned about the risk to the patient. So if they don't have enough information about what's being studied, why the mechanism of action might be appropriate, I think they're going to be reluctant to turn somebody over to a clinical study without really feeling confident that that patient's going to be treated well. So I think there's a number of factors. It's not just the money, but I also think the money's probably an important factor too. It'd be interesting to do a study to find out about doctors in a capitated environment and how willing they are to refer patients compared to doctors on a fee-for-service basis.
Something tells me it would turn into a highly controversial study.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I've saved the hardest question till last. We have just about 3 minutes. We have a question from a group that's quite large and are in the process of starting a study that's going to be run in 20 countries.
Okay.
Could you give kind of the short list of where to start?
What do you mean where to start?
Well, where to start the process knowing that you've got to reach out to patients in 20 different countries?
Oh, I see. Yeah, well, again, if the protocol is not completed yet, obviously, like that one slide I had, I would select the country where you're expecting, or countries, I'd select a handful of countries where you're expecting to get the most patients or where you think it'll be the most difficult to enroll. Ideally, it would be a combination of both those factors. And then test the protocol design with them to see what some of the operational issues are going to be, as well as emotional issues. And then if you've already designed the protocol, then I would take it out to the countries where you'd like to have the most number of patients and do some focus groups to find out, what people think about the study, as well as what kind of messaging is going to resonate to get their attention and help get them in, to take that next step to seek more information, to talk to their doctor, talk to their family, and talk to, hopefully, the investigator. So that's what I would suggest. Now, I can tell you that from my own experience, where we tend to have the most trouble enrolling is normally, I'm assuming once you have regulatory approval and you have your site started, that usually where the biggest problems are from an enrollment standpoint are the United States and in Western Europe. So my suggestion would be that's probably where you want to start, the U.S., and then whichever countries you're really targeting from an enrollment standpoint in Western Europe.
Sounds good. Well, we're coming up on the hour very shortly, so I'd like to thank you, Jim, for your wonderful presentation. I'd like to thank inVentiv for their sponsorship of today's event, and I'd like to thank all of you who spent some time with us today. I hope we were able to provide some solutions to issues that you're facing. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for spending some time with us and wish you a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everybody.